this verse that I just shared with you, somehow this came to me. There are many verses in the Bhagavad Gita which remind me of this scriptural verse in Sanskrit. And the verse that we are going to discuss today is certainly one of them. We are still discussing the 7th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, the chapter on knowledge and discernment, or knowledge and discrimination. And the verse that I picked today, actually I picked a few verses. We'll see how many we get through. I want to start with verse 16, but I also want to touch upon 17 and 18 because it is the same idea that Krishna is working with in all these three verses. I'll first start with verse 16 of the Gita. As always, I'll read the verse first and then read Swami Kriyananda's translation of the verse. Chaturvidha bhajante mam janaha sukritino Arjuna arto jignasu artharti jnani cha bharatarshaba. Now I'll read the literal translation of this verse. Those who seek shelter in me, O Arjuna, are of four types. Those who are in distress, those who seek understanding, those who seek power, and those who are already wise. Now, since I'm on this page, let me read the other two verses also for you. Maybe I'll just read the English translation. I don't need to read the Sanskrit for each one. Verse 17 of the Bhagavad Gita is, outstanding among the wise is he whose devotion is constant and one-pointed. I am above all things dear to him, and he of all beings very dear to me. And verse 18 of the Gita, of the 7th chapter, all of the above four kinds of virtuous men are noble, but the sage who has established himself firmly in me as the highest goal, him I look upon as indeed my own self. So, I'll come back to why that verse came to my mind when I was reading these lines from the Gita. But I'll start with the four kinds of devotees that Krishna is talking about. The four kinds of devotees are arto, that's how he describes them, the ones who are in distress. Jignasu, or the ones that are seeking knowledge or understanding, or another way to translate it is often ones who are curious. The third kind is artharti, the ones who are seeking material fulfillments. And the fourth kind is what Krishna calls jnani, or the ones who are already wise. And these four kinds are interesting. Obviously, you can see the pattern already. The first three are still tainted in ego, and the jnani, or the wise one, is seeking God not out of ego, but of this desire and the wish to transcend ego, of the selfless, desireless desire of merging with the divine. Now, these three devotees, I was meditating yesterday, how interesting Krishna picks these three categories of devotees. The first one is, of course, those who are in distress. I don't need to explain any further on that. All of us know, I certainly have a lot of life experiences to think of when when it comes to me, those that might be seeking spirituality or religion because they are in distress. And that is not a bad thing. That's what Krishna also says here. In my own life, I think when I was 7 or 8 years old, I remember a verse that I studied in school. I was learning the Hindi language, and this is a very famous Hindi poem or a couplet written by the famous saint Kabir. I call Kabir a saint, but as Master describes in the autobiography of a yogi, in fact, he was a great avatar. He was a previous incarnation of Lahiri Mahashai, who was the great avatar who brought the teachings of Kriya Yoga during these times. And this is a poem of Kabir that I remember so fondly from, I think, 2nd grade or so when I was in school. And I'll recite it for you in Hindi because I learned it so many years ago. This is how it goes. Dukh mein sumiran sab kare, sukh mein kare na koi, jo sukh mein sumiran kare, to dukh kahe ko hoy. And this is the literal translation of the verse, which is very, very simple. That's how it stuck with me when I was that young. Everybody worships God when they are in distress, but who worships God when they're happy? Those who do worship God when they're happy, they will probably not have any distress at all. That was such a simple idea expressed so succinctly by Kabir. And I remember it so well because when I was studying this in school, my dad was going through a particular challenge professionally. There was not a lot he could do himself in order to force the outcome that he was looking for, but it was very stressful on him and all of us in the family. And at that time, I remember very well, he started doing all kinds of things, religious offerings, rituals, going to temples, reading verses, waking up at 5 a.m. And I was just amused, for lack of a better word. I was just wondering, and I told my dad, it seems like you are one of those people that Kabir is talking about, who thinks of God when they're in distress. Thankfully, the situation resolved in his favor and it all went well. But I always remembered that verse because that incident was very vivid in my memory, has been very vivid in my memory. But we all know sometimes suffering, distress, heartbreaks in our own lives can be a great impetus to be seeking divine. And it is certainly one of the broad categories of devotees. In fact, I often think of the many, many millions of incarnational cycles that we have been through, all of us have seen a lot of suffering and tumult and heartbreak and disappointment, which is what has been the foundational building block of our devotion and our seeking for the divine. Now, moving on, the next category of devotee that Krishna refers to are the ones who are seeking understanding or the ones who are seeking knowledge. Often that's how it's also translated. And this is a different kind of understanding, not the divine realization or the divine understanding which the wise seek, but the kind of understanding that stems out of a mental curiosity or simply an ego-based desire to understand or to ascertain or analyze things. I think I myself started on the spiritual path in that particular way. I remember when I was only 11 years old, that was the first time I heard about the autobiography of a yogi. And the way I heard about it is because somebody who was much, much older than me told me stories from the autobiography of a yogi and said, this book has all these fascinating stories of this man who would choose to not appear in a photograph of this other saint who can fight tigers with his bare hands. And as an 11-year-old, you can imagine my excitement in wanting to find out more. So it was that desire, that curiosity, that intellectual desire to understand and to know more that actually made me purchase the autobiography of a yogi with my little allowance when I was only 11 years old. It was many, many years later that I actually read the book. But certainly a lot of us are drawn to the spiritual path because of this need or the desire to understand, to mentally put things together, of our curiosity, as Yoganandaji describes in the very first cover page of Autobiography of a Yogi. It's a verse from the Bible. I don't remember the exact word, but I think it says, "Lest ye see miracles, you won't believe." And I think about that. The book is filled with stories of miracles. Of course, the purpose of the book and the purpose of Yogananda's incarnation was not to display to us these tricks of magic, but rather to inspire our own devotion to God. But he speaks to us in all these subtle ways to awaken that devotee in us, no matter what causes that devotee to come out, no matter why we are seeking, we start seeking answers in the right places. The third kind of devotee, obviously, it's not again all that mysterious. Krishna says, those that seek me for material fulfillments. And we have seen enough of that as well in the world. We know that is certainly one of the things that drives people in their life. And it is not the wrong thing to be seeking material fulfillments and praying for them in order to achieve what we are looking for in our lives. But you see, oftentimes we dismiss this particular devotee as those that might be materialistic or those that are simply seeking fulfillment in the world. But we also very often find ourselves in that same predicament. I remember I was once, this was many years ago, I was having a particular difficulty and I had to it was not exactly a financial difficulty, but there were a lot of things on the material plane that were not coming together, and money was certainly a significant part of it. And I was desperately, desperately praying. Now, I did not, even at that time, I'd found the autobiography of a yogi and this particular path by then. I did not think of me as myself, as somebody who was very materialistic or desire for those kind of goals. But when we are in distress, when we are seeking fulfillments, we don't have anywhere else to go but to ask God. All of us, no matter what we pray for, we do have a lot of desires of this world because we are still living in that state where our sense of security does rely to some extent on material things, on our life being a certain way, even our physical health, relationships, how things work out between us and our families, our loved ones, and what happens to our children, what happens to our parents, and whether we can get a particular job, whether we can have a safe and stable life. All those things are things that matter dearly to us. So it is certainly a category of devotee, and it is a kind of devotion that we all have toward God. Now, the one common thread between these three types of devotees, which we will also look at later on in the Gita, where Krishna describes the caste system, is what we call the Vaishya attitude in spirituality. What that means is we make the spiritual path almost a system of barter. We start bartering with God. I'm going to offer you prayers, I'm going to read these verses, I'm going to perform these rituals, and in return, I would like for you to do these things to me. Now, obviously, self-evidently, as I'm describing this, it does not sound like the highest approach to be seeking the divine, but indeed, sometimes we find ourselves in these places, and that is why Krishna is describing these three devotees first. And then, of course, Krishna talks about the wise. The wise, he says, who are already seeking me. And why do the wise seek Krishna? Because the wise have already understood that everything that they're seeking, it cannot come from all these other things. It can only come from God. As St. Augustine beautifully put it, the heart was made for thee, Lord, and it will never find fulfillment until it finds its rest in thee. The wise already understand that all that we are seeking in this world, all of that will be given to us. That fulfillment that we are seeking through these various desires, that will come to us only through God. So coming from that place of realization, they seek God for that ultimate bliss, for His love, for freedom. And that is why Krishna says, of course, the wise is better amongst these four. Again, you don't need Krishna to tell us that, because we already know that way of divine seeking is the highest. Now, the reason these verses spoke to me deeply, and something for us to meditate on in these verses, is how both in verse 16 and 18, Krishna calls all four types of devotees pious. In fact, in the 18th verse, he says, "O Arjuna, all these four kinds of people, remember, they are all noble." And it is something worth for us to think about, because we can often be dismissive of things of this world, things that we need for ourselves, our own reality, and where we are standing in our journey, in this very, very long spiritual journey of hundreds, thousands, millions of incarnations. And Krishna is saying, it doesn't matter where you stand. It doesn't matter that you're in distress, or you need something material, or you're simply curious to find out more. You can be any kind of devotee, and yet you are noble because your consciousness is pointed in the right direction. And that is why I picked that verse from the Indian scripture today. No matter where the droplet of water is coming from, every droplet that is coming from the sky, eventually, it finds its way to the ocean. In the same way, no matter why we start seeking the divine, whether it's because we are in distress, it's because we want a certain understanding, we are curious about something, or we just want material fulfillment, we want material security in this world, we want a good relationship, we want our back pain to go away, we want this particular job, we want the next promotion, we want to be able to upgrade to a new car, we want to fix this thing in our house, we want our children to find the best job, or whatever that is. The fact that we are seeking it from the divine in itself makes that act of seeking noble. And that is something worthy of remembering. And it's something always for us to think about, of how, no matter where we find ourselves, we want to be looking at the divine. We want to have our gaze pointed upward. That is the essence of these three verses. There's many other things that Swami Kriyananda discusses in the commentary, but that's what I want all of us to take home with us from these verses of the Gita, or at least what I can discuss in these brief 25 minutes is, how beautiful it is to contemplate on the fact that God is completely compassionate to all our longings and desires and regrets and fears and hopes. You do not have to be an utter complete renunciate in order for God to pay heed or God to pay attention. There are so many beautiful stories from the Indian scriptures, from the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and the lives of the great avatars, of how Indian scriptures generally depict battle scenes and these huge battles, whether it's the Ramayana or the Mahabharata or stories of the Divine Mother. There's always this battle between good and evil. And it is not a political battle. When you read these stories, you obviously know who you're rooting for. You obviously know who's going to win. There's no suspense. It's not a thriller. And yet there's a certain beauty in reading these stories of always hearing how the good finally emerges victorious. So all these scriptures are full of these images, but if you pay notice, if you go and read these scriptures, you will see how the evil guy, the asuras, the demons, the rakshasas, who finally are vanquished, who are conquered, who are killed by the divine, they actually do not face an ill fate. They are in fact liberated. In the story of the Ramayana, it is beautifully said. Ravana, I don't know how many of you know the story of Ramayana, perhaps most of you do. It is the story of Lord Rama who incarnated in human form, and Ravana is the villain in the story. And I won't get into a lot of details, but Ravana does a lot of things that can be considered not noble, that can be considered sinful. He desires for Rama's wife. He kidnaps her, he imprisons her, and then he wages this war against righteousness, against dharma. And then Rama has to go through a lot of suffering for 14 years until he ultimately wins Ravana in this battle and he's able to kill Ravana. But the way the story is told, ultimately, at the end of his life, Ravana is liberated because he dies thinking of Rama. He spent his life thinking of Rama. I think about that story. What great good karma. This man hated Rama. This man did everything that one might consider sinful. And yet, his devotion was impeccable because he was always thinking of Rama. And it is different from what Krishna is talking about here, but not really, because he in fact ended up thinking of the divine all the time. Although his intention was completely skewed, he completely missed the point. And Krishna is saying, it doesn't matter. As long as you are pointed in the right direction, as long as you are thinking of the divine, you will ultimately reach your goal, just as that water droplet from the sky falling somewhere in some forest, some mountain, eventually finds its way to some home, to somebody's mouth, and then through them, some river, and then finally to the ocean. Ultimately, it is always on its way to reach its ultimate goal in the ocean. And in the same way, all our thoughts, all our desires, if we point them in the right direction, they will ultimately take us to that goal of divine realization. Now, did Ravana have to suffer somewhere in between? Of course he did. That was a very tumultuous adventure of this whole battle of Ramayana. And if we want to avoid all of that, Krishna is giving us a shortcut. We can be established in that wisdom of knowing, of realizing that everything that we are seeking is in fact coming from the divine. And as long as we can stay there, it is much more easier for us to find our way back to that source, back to that goal that we are all seeking. And the other beautiful phrase that I'll bring our attention to in these verses is where Krishna says, I'll read again from Swami Kriyananda's commentary. Him I look upon as my own self. This is verse 18 of the Bhagavad Gita. All these four people are noble, but the wise who has established himself firmly in me as the highest goal, him I look upon as my own self. Now, it's a beautiful phrasing that I appreciate in the scriptures. I was reminded of this line from the autobiography of a yogi when I read this particular verse from the Gita. This is the story from the autobiography, for those of you who have read the book, of when Yoganandaji meets his guru Swami Shri Yukteswar. And if you remember, Yogananda is living in Varanasi in a hermitage. He has renounced his family and he has moved to this hermitage in order to live a life of seeking. And he is running an errand in the market streets. and he sees Yukteswar, and they have this cosmic moment with each other of realizing who they are in the presence of. Yogananda realizing this is his guru that has come to guide him, and Yukteswar realizing this is the disciple that Babaji has sent to him in order to carry the message of Kriya Yoga to the West. And Yukteswar's very first words during that interaction, there's this beautiful silence, and that silence is broken by Yukteswar telling Yogananda, "My own, you have come." What a beautiful, beautiful way to say. It's not even to say that I love you, I admire you, I want everything good for you, but simply saying, you are my own. You are an extension of who I am. And that's how Yukteswar addresses his disciple. And that is the relationship that we have with the divine. It probably goes without saying that we are all a part of God, but it becomes the relationship becomes a lot more conscious when we are seeking his wisdom in the way Krishna is teaching us in these verses of the Gita. Then we become God's own. There's so many, many instances of this in the autobiography of a yogi that we read about. When Larry Masha meets Babaji for the first time, Babaji says something very similar. And then Larry Masha is so deeply touched. And Babaji tells him, I've been watching over you. When you were playing on the sands of the river, covering yourself, sitting in meditation, when you were, when you're a young man, when you found your job, when you got married, when you had your children, I've always had my eye on you. And that's the promise Krishna is offering to all of us in this verse, that we become God's own, and God watches over us. When we are able to live in that wisdom, we don't need to even know who our guru is, what ritual to do, what to follow, what verses to recite, what practice to do if you've not figured those things out in your life already. The fact that we can live with this awareness that what we are seeking has to come from the divine, ultimately always aspiring to live in that state of wisdom of knowing that God is the ultimate source of all that we want in our own life, then we become God's own. Then God starts watching us. That is the attitude of a disciple, to live in this awareness that everything that is coming to us is coming from a divine source. And when we start attuning to that source, when we start attuning to that divine will, then if we are fortunate, then the Guru shows up either in the form of a book or in the form of a real person, in the form of a video you watch on YouTube, in the form of somebody you meet in your life. No matter how that interaction happens, we draw that into our life because we are seeking the divine. And we may be seeking, as Krishna says in these verses, for so many different reasons. We may be seeking because we are in distress. We may be seeking because we are just seeking knowledge and understanding. We may be seeking because we want material fulfillment. But eventually, we have to come to this realization that we are seeking God because what else is worth seeking? That is the attitude of the wise, because there's nothing else in this world other than the divine that is worth seeking. So with that, I'll end this episode, and I'll see you all next week with another verse from the Bhagavad Gita. Until